Hello and welcome to this new episode of Free Science 365. Let me ask you a simple question. Imagine your community is preparing for a new variant of a deadly pathogen. And this pathogen is expected to kill 600 people in your community. Now, two solutions have been proposed. If program A is chosen, 400 people will die. If program B is chosen, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die. But there's a 2/3 probability that everybody will die. Which program do you choose? Please feel free to write your answer in the comments section of this video. Now, I posed the same question to friends and family, and an overwhelming majority, about 80%, would choose program B. Now, let's look at the same problem but with two different options. Your community is preparing for a deadly pathogen attack expected to kill 600 people. But programs A and B are no longer available, so you are presented with two new options, program C and D. If program C is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that all people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved. Which program do you choose? Program C or program D? Stop the video, write your comments if you want to, and then come back. In my surveys to this problem, about 80% of the responses were in favor of program C. But why is that? If you look at them, both programs A and C are the same. Think about it. Program A says 400 people will die, which means out of 600 expected deaths, 400 deaths will happen, which means 200 people will not die, i.e. 200 people will be saved, which is the same as program C. Also, program B says 1 in 3 chance that nobody will die, i.e. all 600 people will be saved, and 2 in 3 chance that all will die, i.e. no people will be saved. That's exactly the same probabilities as program D. So basically, options B and D are risky options. A 2 in 3 chances that all 600 people would die. It's indeed very risky. Options A and C would be called no-risk options, and options B and D are called high-risk options. So basically, if by nature you don't like taking risks, you would choose options A and C. If you do like taking risks, you should choose option B in the first problem and D in the second problem, because these are the risky options. But psychologists have found time and time again the same person chooses option B, a high-risk option, in the first case, and option C, a no-risk option, in the second case. Now, isn't that strange? We choose polar opposite options when presented with the exact same problem, but with different ways of stating the options. What jiggery-pokery is going on? The roots of this strange behavior take us back to a remarkable essay published by an extraordinary genius, Daniel Bernoulli, in the year of 1738. Daniel Bernoulli was a Swiss mathematician and physicist, famous for Bernoulli's principle, which describes the mechanism underlying the operations of 3 important technologies of the 20th century: the carburetor in your petrol gasoline car, the airplane wing, and the blood pressure measuring device. In one of my previous videos, I demonstrated Bernoulli's principle by just using a plastic bottle and a tissue paper. So if you haven't already, you can watch this video here. But very few people know that Bernoulli also did some pioneering work in statistics and probability theory. Daniel Bernoulli was a very logical, very rational man surrounded by equally logical and rational people. But an important event in his life perhaps prompted him to think about the irrationality of human decision-making. What happened was that both Daniel and his father Johann, who himself was a very talented mathematician, entered in a scientific contest which was organized by the University of Paris. Both of them tied for the first place in that scientific contest. But instead of being happy, Johann was unable to bear the shame of being compared as Daniel's equal, and so he banned Daniel from his home. Johann Bernoulli also plagiarized some key ideas in fluid dynamics from Daniel's original work. Despite Daniel's attempts at mending the relationship, his father carried this grudge to his grave. Daniel bore the brunt of his father's irrationality firsthand. Perhaps this bitter experience in his life nudged Daniel Bernoulli into the search of why sometimes we humans choose irrational behavior over rational behavior. He got interested in why sometimes people choose irrational, risky outcomes even when they have a no-risk, rational alternative available. In 1738, he published a brilliant paper in which he attempted to explain that even though people are generally averse to risk, but this risk aversion decreases with increasing wealth, which is irrational. Now, what is risk aversion? It's the propensity of a person to avoid risk as much as possible. If we are given a choice between a risky option and a non-risky option, we should choose the non-risky 100% sure option. For example, let's consider the following two options. Option A, an 85% chance to win, let's say, £100 and a 15% chance of winning nothing. Option B is a sure, no-risk alternative to get £80. A large majority of people would choose option B, although option A has a chance of fetching us more money. The expectation of the gamble in option A is £85, which is obviously more than the no-risk alternative of £80 in option B. Even I would still choose option B because it's a sure gain. This preference of a smaller but sure gain or a bigger but riskier expectation is called risk aversion. On the other hand, the preference of a bigger but riskier expectation or a smaller but surer gain is called risk seeking. So basically, we humans exhibit either a risk-seeking behavior or a risk-averse behavior. Now, if we human beings are rational, which the economics textbooks try to teach us that we are, then we should always choose a risk-averse outcome, and we should never choose a risk-seeking outcome. But what Bernoulli suggested is that risk aversion decreases with increasing wealth. In simple terms, it means if you offer options A and B to, let's say, a homeless person, they would prefer a sure £80, a risk-averse choice. But if you offer the same options A and B to a rich person, let's say someone who has millions of pounds in their bank account already, there is a high chance that they will not be as risk-averse as the homeless man. They would choose a risk-seeking option, option A. But why? Because when making economic decisions, people do not always try to maximize their possible money gain, but rather they maximize their subjective utility from that money gain. To the man on the street, it's obvious that a sure £80 gain is better than a probable £85 gain. The famous adage, a bird in hand is better than two in the bush, tells us just that. But Bernoulli discovered that this is an example of the subjective and irrational emotional human behavior and not a rational decision. If we humans are always rational, then doesn't matter how much money you have in your pocket or in your bank account, a £0 or £1 million, we should always choose a risk-free option. A person with £100 in hand will have more value of an extra £80, but a person with, let's say, £1 million in bank will have less value of the same extra £80. This is irrational, and that was the genius of Bernoulli. Daniel Bernoulli's findings helped us understand the irrational decision-making of us humans in the 21st century. In the 1970s, another Daniel Kahneman, took the baton from Bernoulli and started doing experiments to understand why we humans make risky choices. In the 1970s, two behavioral psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, designed experiments to understand what Daniel Bernoulli had discovered 300 years ago, i.e., we humans make irrational decisions. And they discovered something amazing. So, Daniel Bernoulli talked about gains. When people stand to gain a sure £80, they sometimes prefer to take a risky £85. He only studied gain. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky studied losses. Consider two people losing 80 quid each. The first one has £10,000 and the second one has £100 in their pockets. Even though both of them lost the same amount of money, i.e. £80, the feeling of the loss will be much stronger in the person who had £100 to begin with than the person who had £10,000 in the bank. So for the person with £100 in hand, a loss of £80 will be much more painful than the happiness of gaining £80. For this person, the loss of £80 will be 3 times more painful emotionally than the happiness they would derive from the gain of £80. Now, isn't that irrational? Yes, but that's human behavior. We humans feel 3 times more pain when we lose the same thing than when we gain it. This is irrational behavior. But how does this all apply to human decision making? This basically means that when we stand to gain, we choose the risk-averse option. We don't want to take any risks. But when we stand to lose, we choose the risk-seeking option. For example, in the first question that I asked, in option A, 400 people will die. Now, dying is a loss. The word die creates a feeling of loss in our brains. So, in that case, we are ready to take the risk. But in the second part of the same question, I changed the statement from 400 people will die to 200 people will live. Now that's a gain option. That's a positive frame. When we have a gain frame, we feel we are going to gain something. We don't want to take the risk, and so we choose the safer no-risk option. The pioneering work of Daniel Kahneman was so extraordinary that the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 was conferred on him. Just think about it for a second. A behavioral psychologist with no training in classical economics gets the Nobel Prize in economics. Why? Because Daniel Kahneman's work on the irrational decision-making of human beings applies most commonly to economic decisions. Basically, his research proved that the Homo economicus, the rational man theory of economics, was simply not true. So Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and Richard Thaler, along with other researchers, proved fair and square that we can easily be nudged towards making irrational, riskier decisions. One way our decisions can be influenced is called framing. If the options are described or framed in terms of possible gain, we are more likely to choose a risk-averse option. But if the options are framed in terms of possible losses, we are more likely to choose a risk-seeking option. Now, what are the implications of the emotional framing effect on the economic decision-making of the person on the street? In 2009, Dr. Jonathan Roiser did an amazing experiment to find just that. In 2009, a team of neuroscientists at University College London, led by Dr. Jonathan Roiser, did a study of framing effects to see how the decisions of the participants affect the activity in different areas of the brain. Now, each participant was asked to imagine there was 50 quid on the table. Participants were then instructed that they would not be able to retain the whole 50 quid, but next they had to choose between a sure and a gamble option. They had to make the same decision twice. First through the gain frame and then the loss frame. In the gain frame, they had 2 options. Option A was to keep 20 quid for sure. And option B was to gamble on a wheel of chance. There was a 60% probability that they would gain nothing. And only 40% probability that they would gain the entire 50 quid. So option A is the safe, rational choice. Option B was to gamble, which was the gamble choice. But remember, the frame here is gain frame. You keep 20 quid. Out of 50 quid, just take 20 quid, put in your pocket and walk away. As simple as that. Option B was to then gamble. Then after some time, the same person was asked to come back. Now they had the same 50 quid on the table, but this time the frame was the loss frame. They were then given 2 options. Option A was to lose 30 quid for sure. What would that mean? That means the test taker would take 30 pounds away from the table and that would leave only 20 quid. So objectively, it was the same as gain 20 quid. Out of 50, the researcher takes 30 quid and walks away and leaves 20 quid for you is the same thing. So option A was lose 30 quid for sure. Option B was the same as the gamble above. If the wheel stops on white, they would receive the entire 50 quid. If the wheel stops at black, they would receive nothing. And despite the identical nature of the decision in the gain and the loss frames, which, by the way, all the volunteers realized that it was the same thing, the study showed that participants were more likely to gamble if the first option, option A, was phrased in terms of losing rather than keeping money. But in the gain frame, majority of the participants chose keep 20 quid option. By just changing the word from gain 20 quid to lose 30 quid, the emotions evoked in the brains of the participants changed, and those emotions then leaked into the final decision. As a result, in the loss frame, they took a risk, which is an irrational decision, which left them worse off. But here, we had unsuspecting people who don't have formal professional training of any kind. What if we tried the emotional framing effect on highly skilled, highly trained, sophisticated professionals such as doctors and surgeons trained in some of the best institutions of medical science in the world? Amos Tversky devised an experiment at Harvard Medical School to find just that. In 1982, Amos Tversky and others carried out an experiment on graduate students and doctors at Harvard Medical School. 491 graduate students and 424 physicians were asked to imagine that they had lung cancer. The participant doctors were then given statistics about the outcomes of two treatments for lung cancer: surgery and radiation. Now, all these graduate students and doctors at Harvard Medical School knew very well that the 5-year survival rate of surgery is clearly better than the radiation option. But in the short term, surgery is riskier than radiation. In other words, the participants' rigorous medical training at one of the finest medical schools in the world, i.e. Harvard Medical School, had given them the objective knowledge that in the long term, surgery is better than radiation. No doubt about it. So Tversky and his team made two frames here: the positive frame of survival rate and the negative frame of mortality rate. Survival is a good word, a positive word, so it's a positive frame. Mortality, death, is a negative word. Half of the participants were given this description about surgery option. The 1-month survival rate is 90%. The rest half of the participants were given this description about surgery. The first month mortality rate is 10%. Now think about it. It's the same thing. The 1-month survival rate is 90%, and hence the mortality rate is 10%. And by the way, these are well-trained doctors and graduate students who would go on to become doctors in the future. The results: surgery was chosen over radiation by 84% of the participating physicians in the positive survival rate frame group. But only 50% physicians chose surgery in the negative mortality rate frame. What does it mean? It means that even expert professionals such as doctors and surgeons are affected by the emotions of how information is presented to them. Now, isn't that crazy? Rigorous professional medical training couldn't save these physicians from the ferocious force of the framing effect. The emotional framing is more powerful than rigorous professional medical training in one of the best medical schools in the world. In the next episode, we'll talk in more detail about another aspect of framing effect, i.e. opt-in and opt-out frames. And I can promise you, you will be very surprised by how governments and private companies alike use these frames, the emotional frames of opt-in and opt-out, to nudge the decisions of the common man. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.